Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this opening plenary of the Global Solutions Summit. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists today, Mr. Chinoy, Mr. Sonobi, Ms. Lucinda Trigo-Gamarra, and Mr. Colm Kelly to join the stage. Thank you. Hi. So, very happy to be meeting in person, all of us together today. We are gathered to discuss, as Professor Snow was saying, the urgent need for societies to realign to a sustainable, inclusive, and common future. So, as we know, the challenges we face are very complex, multifaceted, so I'm sure we are going to have a very provocative conversation to set the stage for the next 2 days. So our distinguished panelists today bring a wealth of knowledge and experience from corridors of power to activism and corporate responsibility. So I'm sure we'll have a very multidisciplinary conversation today here. So let me start by Suchan. You are well committed to T20 this year, co-chairing this network. What is your first thought about the priorities this year for the T20 in setting global cooperation?
Well, thank you very much for this invitation. Das ist mein erster Besuch in Deutschland. Und ich freue mich sehr, hier zu sein. Danke für Ihre Einladung. Thank you very much for this invitation. Let me begin by firstly stating the obvious that the G20 for India is an exceptionally different one. It is aimed at building consensus on the fundamental principle that the entire world is one family. So that's where we proceed from. Therefore, our logo, as you know, is one earth, one family, one future. Now, the problem with realigning societies is that you could as well have said realigning nations. I don't quite think the Westphalian notion of a nation state is past. It has evolved differently in different geographies. Europe, in fact, is very different from other parts of the world. Here, it is more appropriate to speak of realigning societies, which have a transnational connotation, and which also bring in the intrinsic role of civil society, of big business, big tech, etc. But in Asia, the geography from where, for instance, I come, there are other contextual things that are very important, such as history, civilization, the ability of Asia to have, for instance, made great progress on the economic front, but having failed to build a common security architecture. Some might say that is now proving to be true of Europe as well. So when you speak of realigning societies, and from the perspective that we have of treating the world as one family, the short point here is that the global architecture that we have put in place since 1945, it's not easy to dismantle. In fact, global orders do not change because of a change of heart. They normally change because of large events, economic, political, military, cataclysmic events at time. That's been the history. We have seen that the structure that's been put in place in 1945 has failed to deliver, essentially because of great power contestation, but more fundamentally because of the intrinsic exceptionalism and privileged positions that are inherent in the system. I mean, I was reading that the UN Charter, which is actually supposed to be the final realignment for all of us after that disastrous war, and which is not quite in place yet, the Charter would not have been agreed upon had the powers not agreed on what you call the veto power. So in fact, at that point of time, history tells us that it was an exchange, a deal in exchange for some people retaining the veto power. To conclude my opening remarks, India, in fact, believes that this is not an era of war. This is an era in which we must actually have conversations. And it is not enough to simply say that this is a conversation between democracies and autocracies. There is a spectrum out there. When we look at the global international order, the rules-based international order, or democracy, there are views and there are different types of democracies being practiced, hybrid democracies as well. And so instead of having a pitched battle today between either civil societies in one part of the world and governments in another part of the world, or between democracies and autocracies, what we really should be doing is sitting across the table and trying to build a broad consensus on the key issues that challenge us today. Fundamentally, the ones that were outlined by Mr. Dennis Snow in his remarkable opening remarks, such as, for instance, the challenge of climate change, or economic recovery, or, for instance, having a digital public infrastructure in the industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, that does not make for a digital colonization. Having had industrial revolution 3.0, which was a manufacturing kind of revolution, it did give people a chance to catch up. But then not everyone has benefited equally from globalization either. The outliers today are not simply outliers because they didn't want to be part of globalization. They haven't had a fair chance. And if we continue down this road, we will not be able to build any kind of future of the type that India envisages. One earth, one family, one future. The entire world is one family.
Thank you, Sujan. Lucinda, shall we? In your role in Germany, Sous-Sherpa to G20 and G7, how are you seeing the possibility of cooperation among countries in these two fora? And what is your take on this moment?
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you for having me. And as my previous speaker, as Sujan just said, I couldn't agree more that this is the time for cooperation, for global cooperation. We face enormous challenges. Some of them, the most important, have been mentioned by Professor Snow in his opening remarks and also by Sujandrath now. Tackling these challenges will require global multilateral cooperation. No country, region, no global institution, no governance forum in the world will be able to tackle those challenges alone. We need to stick together and to cooperate. And as we look ahead to the G7 summit that is taking place in a couple of days in Japan and Hiroshima later this week, and as we look ahead to the G20 summit in New Delhi in September, I think the message needs to be clear that both G7 and G20 have very, very important roles in addressing and providing solutions to the challenges we face, and they need to cooperate. This is why Chancellor Scholz last year, during Germany's G7 presidency, decided to invite partner countries to the Elmau summit, including India. This is why Prime Minister Kishida has decided to invite partner countries to Hiroshima, also many of them from the G20, to discuss the challenges ahead together and to tackle solutions. And what is also clear is that governments alone will not be in a position to provide solutions, but we will need the global society, and this is why the engagement groups and groups such as the T20 and the T7 are so important to our work. So we will need input from the global society, and we will need to work with the private sector. Let me give two concrete examples of how we, as Germany, during the German G7 presidency last year, have tried to provide very concrete examples and solutions to global challenges in this, let's say, in this spirit. First one, the Climate Club. During Germany's G7 presidency last year, Chancellor Scholz suggested the idea of setting up an international open cooperative climate club to bring forward the very much needed mitigation, climate mitigation, in particular in the industry sector. So what is the idea? The idea is to cooperate to bring forward mitigation in the industry sector, which is very hard where, as we all know, emissions are very hard to reduce. So why is this climate club a new idea? Well, it has a very concrete focus. It brings in the private sector because it focuses on the industry decarbonization, for which, of course, we will need the cooperation of the private sector. And it has a third pillar, the third pillar being that we need to reach out to cooperate with other countries beyond the G7 to help them, bring them in the climate club, help them to also be able to join the climate club and contribute to the goal of the climate club in doing so. Since Elmo last year, the Climate Club has already reached out beyond the G7. We are very happy to have Chile on board as co-chair. Many other countries, including Argentina, have expressed their interest in joining the Climate Club. For me, this is a very practical example of how we can and we have to set up new models of cooperation to address the challenges we face. Second example, the Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment that was set up last year, also at the Elmo Summit, and which aims at providing sustainable infrastructure to countries in the Global South. We committed as G7 to provide up to $600 billion US dollars up to 2027 to build sustainable infrastructure. Of course, this gigantic number shows you that we will not be able to do that on our own, but we will need the private sector to come in. And again, since we established this important initiative, it has grown. We have reached out to the G20. We had a side event on the PGII in Bali. We are looking forward to cooperating with the Indian presidency on this as well. So this is yet another example on how we can tackle the challenges we face. And I agree, we face enormous challenges, but I also find I'm of the view that we have a common agenda to tackle those. It is the Sustainable Development Goals that we all agree to as global community. It is the Agenda 2030. We are halfway through this year, and we are facing a situation where we basically are falling behind almost every sustainable development goal. So we have to use this year to see where do we stand and what do we have to do to achieve the goals until 2030. And we are extremely grateful to the Indian presidency that they have put the sustainable development goals and the issue of global development at the center of their agenda. And we stand ready to support the Indian presidency in achieving a successful Delhi summit. And in that respect, I couldn't agree more that we need a reform of the global institutions, of the international financial architecture. And we are working on it, actually. This year, the reform of the multilateral development banks is a major topic, both for the G7 and the G20. And we have to look at all the international financial institutions and analyze for all of them, do they still face the right membership and governance structure? Is the governance structure representative of today's global economic realities? And the second question we have to ask ourselves is the mandate of this institution still the right one for the global challenges we are facing? And we are doing this with the multilateral development banks, with the World Bank, and we are actually adapting the mandates of these institutions and making them fit for the future. So I agree, the challenges are huge, but I think we are doing a lot to tackle those, and once again, we need to do that together, and the G7 and the G20 need to work cooperatively together to achieve this.
Thank you, Lucinda. Thank you. Let's turn to you, come from the private sector view, Lucinda. providing a more optimistic view about what we can achieve, was talking about the role of private sector in not only governments being involved in this change. We are now clear that we have global problems. I think the symptoms are shared by everyone. Do we have global solutions to those global problems at the moment? What is your take?
Well, first of all, I wholeheartedly agree. The private sector, market economies have to be part of this solution. The problems are so significant, so pervasive, that we have to keep our economies function to meet the needs of people and planet. And we have to go through the institutional framework that, in the way that you've described, to make it fit for purpose, to bring it to deal with today's world, with the ambition that we should have to reflect on the outcomes we want for our people, for our family on a global basis. But I do want to go back to what Dennis said in his opening remarks, and he talked about recoupling, because we have a decoupling challenge. And I'm a little worried that we are not necessarily recognizing the fact that we have a pretty serious design problem with our market economies. Because to be blunt, our market economies were not designed to address the kinds of problem that we are now facing. They're not designed to address climate issues. They're not designed to address issues related to nature, or indeed to social inclusion and fairness and equity. That's quite a significant, serious problem for us collectively if we intend to use market economies in order to respond to these kinds of challenge. Which means that we have to deal with the symptoms by definition, but we have got to get after this design issue. We have to ensure that our market economies and the institutional framework within which they operate are intentionally focused on delivering the outcomes that we want for people and planet. That is not the case today. That is not the case today. And that means that without that focus on orienting the system in that way, we will continue to have tremendous frustration at the failure to respond, but we will also make these issues worse. And I think we see these issues continuing to deteriorate very much as you described earlier. Just to be clear, that sounds like a very negative statement. It's intended to be in some respects, but just to be clear, there is some progress being made. And if I take climate as an example in the business community space, there's increasing anxiety on the part of many business leaders about the need to respond to the climate issue, for example. And we see increasing participation in what I would describe as coalitions of the willing. So businesses coming together in order to harness their collective potential to respond to these issues to drive change. The problem with coalitions of the willing, there are really two risks. One is that coalitions like that of the willing of volunteers tend to fracture under pressure. And we're already beginning to see evidence of that. When the pressure comes on in a system which is designed to encourage different activities, those coalitions tend to start fraying around at the edges. The second, in some cases less obvious, but actually in some respects even more serious problem, is that for many it is advantageous to stay out of these coalitions, which means that we end up with beneficiaries in the category of business and others who choose to continue to participate in the old system with old behaviours and old decisions which drive the outcomes that we continue to have concern about. So there's no question in my mind that we have to recognise this global interdependence in a respectful cultural manner. We have to reorganise our institutional frameworks in order to make them fit for purpose. We also have to intentionally orient our market economies and then the behaviours of businesses in order to align with the outcomes that we clearly have a common interest in addressing. Those outcomes will be very different in different cultural contexts, different realities, places with different histories and so on, but there are some realities which are totally shared, and climate and nature are two entirely obvious ones. We cannot do this without collaboration between the stakeholders that we're talking about. So that would be my ask. It would be to do more, go more quickly, demand that we support the agenda that you're describing and are willing to support the changes, and expect us to be held accountable on that basis as well.
Thank you, Colm. Well, Mr. Stonover, after these interesting remarks and especially different views, rather optimistic, rather pessimistic, what is your take? And now leading the T7, this new network of think tanks, what is your take about how challenges are going to be met by global institutions?
Yeah, thank you, Furia. So, and thank you very much, Global Solutions Initiative, for giving me this opportunity to speak here. And I would like to congratulate the Global Solutions Initiative to convene so many people, the different people. Some are from China, some are from Africa, and then the private sector, policy makers, ambassadors, and then students and the think tank colleagues. And congratulations on these people who participate this great meeting. So I'd like to start by reporting to you that Think 7 Japan has had T7 summit 27-28 of April in Tokyo, and then produced this communique and then handed over this communique to the G7 president, that is Prime Minister Kishida, on 28 Friday. And then I went to Incheon, Korea, and where the ADB, my parent company, which is multilateral bank, that's a bank. I'm a think tank, and then to talk about this kind of T7, T20, and then went to Mumbai to join the T20 India mid-year conference. T20 is led by the Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, and then I talked, I attended, I appeared at several meetings there. And then I came from Mumbai to Berlin yesterday. And then I could enjoy this museum island a little bit, but I wonder why I'm so busy. And of course, the reason is I'm hosting T7. And then wonder why I'm doing T7 and then working with T20, and then why I'm doing think tank. And then I think my answer is that to this why question is that I believe that think tanks can play an important role to making our planet sustainable, the world peaceful, society harmonious, and the economy prosperous by bridging policy making and research science. Okay? So the scientists can provide evidence which will improve the policy making. But also think tanks can bring the voices of the different parts of the civil societies to policymakers, together with the scientific evidence and the reasoning. The question is how this gap in time horizon or time preference between the policymakers and the researchers can be filled, right? So policymakers are those who cannot wait, and then researchers are those who want to take longer time. So then you may think that, think tanks can kind of, like banks, combine, bridge the, depositors and borrowers and lenders. So maybe think tanks can do some magic to bridge the two worlds. And then you introduced us as if we are the world's greatest mind. But that's not true, obviously. We are very far from Nobel Prizes. So we are much smaller. Think tanks are much smaller than the smallest universities. But nonetheless, we can ask the world, smartest, wisest, or most knowledgeable people, right? So researchers in the world, and also the great minds in the world, including the great person like Sujan. And then also the greatest, business leaders in the world. And then we can quickly deliver the latest or state-of-the-art knowledge useful for policy making to the policymakers. And then that may work or may not work, but that's the limit. That's the frontier knowledge. So it's not, if it doesn't work, it's not the think tank's fault. So I'm a bit tired because of the too much schedule, but still my mental condition is okay because I don't have to worry about the result of the applying knowledge to policy making. But of course, we can carefully listen to policymakers and also researchers and other wise people so that we can make a best match between demand and supply.
Thank you, Mr. Sonobe. I think we are running out of time, and I don't have the magic of having additional minutes for this conversation, although I think it should be great to keep talking and exchanging. I think the summit was born 6 years ago, and the need for this type of conversation is as urgent as ever. So I hope we can continue these conversations, especially because the Global Solutions Summit has become a very important and a unique forum for these type of conversations about global problems, but especially about global solutions and how we can get to them. So thank you very much for this conversation, and hopefully we'll have 2 very intensive days of keeping on this issue. So thank you very much, and
Thank you, Julia.
let me thank
you very much.
esteemed experts. Thank you so much.